Hey everybody, this is Oren Hartov. I am the Watches Editor for Gear Patrol, and today I'm joined by a very special guest. He was previously CEO at Analog Shift in New York City, seller of very fine vintage watches. Today, he is a consultant at Phillips Auction House, and he's the founder of Rolleifest, which is a gathering of some of the most esteemed Rolex collectors in the world. He himself is one of the most knowledgeable Rolex collectors anywhere. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Oren. You're a dear old friend, and it's so great to be here.
Thank you. So today, Jeff, who has an incredibly wide knowledge on vintage watches, is going to talk to us a bit about the auction world. He's a consultant with Phillips, an expert on vintage Rolex amongst other brands, and he has some very interesting ideas and analysis about where pricing is going in the auction world and why someone should consider buying a watch at auction if they're looking for something in particular. So Jeff, I want to talk a bit about, you have a very analytical way of looking at auctions and the auction scene. We talk about in vintage watches, is there a bubble? There's been such incredibly strong pricing, not only in vintage watches, in vintage Rolex, but in vintage watches across the board. And they seem to just be going up and up. What is your take on pricing relative to both retail and at auction?
Well, I'll say I do not think there's a bubble in the vintage watch world. What I do perceive, and I've said this before, is that I think collectors are struggling a little bit to create the right balance, the right equilibrium between passion and investment. And what do I mean? Passion is really the reason why a collector buys a watch. It's what keeps him up at night studying the details of a watch. It's what drives him to buy a watch. But there's also the realities of today's day, where in the past 4, 5, and 6 years, vintage watches have escalated in price dramatically. And while it used to be taboo to talk about investment, on the forums we would often see people raise that word, and responses would be, oh, just buy what you love, don't think about investment. I think it would be naive for a collector to completely ignore that fact. And it is a legitimate part of the equation in today's day. So I think collectors are trying to find the perfect balance between passion and investment. On one hand, of course, a collector needs to be passionate about the watch that he's buying. He has to love it. It's, again, the thing that keeps him up all night, studying the details of the watch. But he or she also has to think about the investment side to some degree now as well, and perhaps more so than ever before. And what do I mean? He has to think, is this a good place to put money? Watches have escalated in prices dramatically over the past years. Is this watch a liquid asset? Can I sell it? Will I make money? Will I lose money? Is there a market for it? How fast can I sell it if I need to sell it or I want to sell it? And I think what we're seeing is not a bubble, but rather collectors just trying to figure out the right balance between buying a watch because they love it and the passion that they have for it, but at the same time recognizing that prices are a bit higher than they've been in recent past, and recognizing that they have to decide, is this a safe and an okay place to make an investment or an expenditure in dollars?
So in terms of thinking about a watch as an investment, you might look at the fundamentals of a company when analyzing a stock, and you speak about the fundamentals of a watch. Can you tell me a little bit about what that means to you? We're not looking at PE ratio or shares outstanding. What are we looking at when we're looking to invest in a high-end watch?
I'll tell you, I would never recommend that somebody buy a watch much like he or she might buy a stock in a publicly traded equity market, in the stock market. But I can make an analogy. When markets are trading on fundamentals and a stock trader is able to buy or sell a stock based on the fundamentals of the company that he's looking at, it typically means that the market is healthy and stable. Now, how do we make a connection to the watch world? So what I'm seeing now in the watch world, and notably in the auction world, is that those speculators are starting to drop out. And what I'm seeing in the auction rooms are a larger number of collectors raising the paddle and a larger number of A-level top dealers with knowledge raising the paddle. And in my view, I view that as a very healthy, stable environment, perhaps more so than ever before, because it's not subject to the influence of speculators. And the collector and the top dealer is able to buy a watch based on the fundamentals of the watch. And in that case, what it really means is the collector is able to buy for the right reason. He's able to buy a watch that he loves, that he's passionate about, that means something to him. And he, along with the dealers, are able to analyze those watches based on rarity and condition and all the things that you might typically examine when deciding whether to buy a watch. So I view the auction world now as entering into a very healthy phase where speculators are dropping out and the people raising the paddle are more likely to be consumers, collectors, and top dealers who are really buying for the right reasons. So in my view, we're looking at a very healthy, stable time.
And this has some advantages to your mind over, say, buying something secondhand at retail. You and I have both, you were CEO at Analog Shift, still sells some incredible vintage pieces, but you think, for the reasons you just outlined, buying at auction brings some more to the equation?
Look, there are some advantages to buying a watch at auction. That is by no means to say that there aren't great watches sold privately through some of the great dealers and friends, and many of my watches have been bought privately. There's no question about it. So by no means am I saying that you can't buy a great watch from a dealer or a friend. Of course you can. But I am recognizing that there are a few advantages to buying at auction that are most notable in my mind. First and foremost, access to great pieces. There is no question in my mind that some of the larger and more prominent auction houses will have access to very special pieces, and in some instances, the most special pieces. And let me give you a fact that was a little bit startling to me in a very positive way. At the last set of Phillips auctions in Geneva, there were almost 2,000 registered bidders.
This was a couple weeks ago?
A couple of weeks ago. Almost 2,000 registered bidders. That's online, that's on the telephone, and that's in the room. It was also reported to me that those 2,000 registered bidders came from just north of 70 countries. So one advantage to the auction process is that the more notable auction houses will likely have access to very special pieces that might not otherwise make it into private hands. And you know, I've brought two watches that I've brought at auction, and these are very special and very dear to me, and it's always fun to talk about watches and show watches. So what I've brought with me today are two watches that I bought at auction. They're both 1963. They're both gilt gloss steel Rolex sports models. One is a 5513, and it's notable in that it has the word Swiss twice on the bottom and a little underline, so we call it underline double Swiss. That double Swiss and that underline are indications on the dial that represent a transition in the composition of lume from radium to tritium.
They were made very briefly, correct?
They were made very briefly in a very narrow period of time as Rolex began to transition from radium to tritium. Similarly, I bought at auction a GMT underline double Swiss, of course from the same year, basically 1963. These are cherished watches. I bought them both at auction. And it bears noting that I bought the first watch through my good friend Paul Boutros at Philips.
Whom you now work with.
Who I now work with. And it was a few years later that he said, "Hey Jeff, I found something very interesting that's coming up in our auction in Hong Kong. It's the mate to your Submariner. It's a double Swiss underline GMT. It would make for a perfect pair." It was very beneficial in my case to have this relationship because I likely would not have otherwise found that watch.
Whether through retail or just network.
I mean, I'm not going to say that watches of this quality don't show up privately. Of course they do. But these are very good examples of top quality watches that are very, very special that I had access to because of the auction world and through the auction world. The other advantage that's relevant and that's tied to vetting is more indirect, and that's as follows. A watch that goes to auction is subject to public scrutiny. So a watch that goes to auction will get published. It will get published in a printed catalog. It will get published in an online catalog. It may very well get featured in social media, and it's subject to public scrutiny. So when one buys at auction, presumably a strong auction house, one has the advantage of the benefit of the international specialists that are vetting the watch, in addition to the public that actually scrutinize the watch. And in some cases, there's a third level of vetting, and that can come from a board of advisors. In some instances, again, I can only speak to Philips, there is a strong board of advisors with some of the leading collectors and experts of the world, guys like John Goldberger and Jean-Claude Biver that are on the board of advisors. And when there are questions, the auction house has access to a real wealth of knowledge to be able to check watches and bounce ideas off of. So again, some of the advantages to buying at auction include access to special watches and the comfort in knowing that watches are vetted on a whole variety of levels, be it an advisory board level, be it a public scrutiny level, or be it on the level of the international specialists working directly through the auction house.
And given your affinity for Rolex in particular, I mean, your Instagram handle is Manhattan Rolly. You're particularly in the Rolex world specifically. I assume in your capacity as a consultant there that you're relied heavily upon for your expertise in vintage Rolex.
I like to think so. I get the great benefit of every day doing something that I love. I've been passionate about watches and particularly Rolex for many, many years. So many of my friends from all over the globe share that passion. So I feel enormously blessed that I get to work with the team of people that I get to work with and that I get to play with watches like this on a regular basis. And it's really a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm sure. If you're a collector, let's say you've been buying at retail, maybe you're a serious collector, but the auction world is intimidating to you. How does that type of person break into this? It seems like something that takes a little bit of education and practice and maybe knowing somebody.
Breaking into the auction world is filling out a piece of paper with your name, address, telephone number, and email address. That is as simple as it gets. That is the barrier to entry between participating in an auction and not participating in an auction. It's that simple to register.
Do you have any other just sort of top-line advice for somebody to follow who is first getting into buying at auction?
You know, the first level of advice is become almost like a cliche. It's buy what you love and love what you buy. If we get beyond that, that's definitely the most important thing. Buy what you love. If we get beyond that, one thing I've really noticed, and frankly social media has contributed to this, and that is don't just follow the herd. People frequently measure success in comparison to their peers. The watch community is often susceptible to a herd mentality. It's human nature. And it frequently explains why some references suddenly double or triple in price in a very short period of time, in a year, when there's really no fundamental reason for that happening. It's human nature to follow trend and to follow the herd. And we see this in many, many businesses and in many different markets, and we certainly do see it in the watch market. I would always try to advise somebody that, as hard as it is, and it's difficult because we're all susceptible to it, but to the extent you can resist the urge to follow the herd, I think you'll be all the better for it. And some of the collectors that I admire most are those that didn't follow the herd and they really just bought what they loved. It doesn't mean that they didn't pay attention to the investment side and didn't pay attention to the notions of, okay, is this a wise place to put money? Is this an okay purchase?
Still buying good watches.
Absolutely, that's imperative, but they didn't just buy a watch because everybody else was buying it. So as difficult as it is, to the extent a buyer at auction can not just follow the herd and take advantage of some of the special pieces that auction houses often offer, I think that a collector would enjoy the experience that much more over the long term.
This has all been super great advice, and I thank you for your insight and for coming in and for sharing it with our readers.
You know, it's a total pleasure for me, Warren. Many, many thanks.
Thank you, sir.